Dr. Gail Dines, a Professor Emerita of Sociology and Women's Studies. She's been researching and writing about the porn industry for well over 30 years. She's the author of numerous books and articles. Her latest book, Pornland, How Porn Has Hijacked Our Sexuality, has been translated into 5 languages. A radical feminist for as long as she can remember, she sees fierce activism as the only way out of this patriarchal mess.
I'm going to talk about identity politics and versus the materiality of women's lives. And what I'm going to do is sort of explain from a historical perspective how we kind of got into this hideous mess of the so-called pro-sex work, pro-porn, so-called feminists. And I'm going to give somewhat of a historical analysis and then go into where we're up to today. So it's going to start with the second wave of the 1960s. So we're going to look at what happened there, because this is where we saw the divisions that exist now between the radical feminists and not so much anymore the liberal, but rather the neoliberal, because the liberal has switched over to neoliberal, which I'll explain later. So the big battle line was a structural view of patriarchy versus an individual view of gender inequality. So that's kind of how we're going to look at it. Now, one of the major books of the second wave was Betty Friedan, which was a liberal feminist position. And her argument, Betty Friedan was an interesting woman. She was a journalist, and she did something quite profound in the 1950s. When she wanted to know about women, she actually asked women, which you have to understand in those days, you didn't do that. If you wanted to know anything about women, you asked men, right? They were the experts on women. So she really, on that level, did something that was important. She spoke to women and she said to them, what are your lives like? And she often did it at the kitchen table in the suburbs. And what she found was everyone kept talking about the problem and the issue. And she actually called it the problem with no name. What it was she was finding that these women who were had moved from the sort of inner city and were now the upwardly mobile middle class white women, moved into the suburbs, were completely alone, isolated, didn't have any extended family around them, and were incredibly depressed. And of course, this was the beginnings of putting women on all sorts of drugs, women drinking. At that time, they started doing recipes for sweet alcoholic drinks because they knew that women were turning to drink as well, just because they were so depressed and couldn't stand it. And they didn't have any language. Just think when you've got no language to talk about your life. So that's the good thing she did. Now, what she said is the only way for a woman, as for a man, is to find herself, to know herself as a person, is by creative work of her own. So what she said is to women, many of whom were college educated, she was speaking to, is go out and get a job. You need to get out of the house and go and get a job, join the workforce. Now, this is where the divisions began, because really she was speaking to only white middle-class women living in the suburbs. That was her audience. And her belief that the answer was individual women entering the workplace ignored the fact that poor white women and women of color had always worked, right? They didn't have to go back to the workplace. For them, the workplace was not a source of liberation for these women. It was actually a source of oppression. So she really didn't get the race issue. She also was quite naive, as were many liberal feminists in that time, was that the workplace would meet the needs of women with children. She also believed if we put more women in the workplace, we'll be more women-centered. Well, how did that work out for us? She had no analysis of capitalism or racism, because she did not understand really the ways in which white upper middle class women probably could get a foot in the door, but other women were not going to be. They were going to be relegated, as we'll talk about, to the more service industries. She also didn't understand the dexterity of patriarchy and capitalism to co-opt feminism, which is exactly what they did. And actually, for those who live in the United States, there's an excellent 10-part documentary on Playboy, which looks at the history of Playboy, which I would definitely recommend. It blows the lid off. It shows Hefner to be a pimp, a rapist, the lot. And he was a huge figure in co-opting feminism. He gave money to the ACLU, to the National Organization of Women. So he was very central, Hefner and Playboy, in co-opting feminism. Now, the big issue here is she didn't understand that the empowerment, and I'm using the term empowerment here because she used a similar word. She did not talk about liberation. She talked about empowerment, which is a very different concept. She knew the empowerment of the white, she didn't get it, but she was sort of subtextually that the empowerment of these white women was based on the low paid labor of women of color and white women. Why? Because there was no daycare. Right? Who was going to look after the kids? Who was going to do all the shit work of the home that women have always been relegated to? Of course, in the United States, it was mainly women of color. And in fact, what we know is that the empowerment, or women going out and making money, white women, was actually on the backs of poor white women, and especially women of color. So you have this beginning of not understanding the intersectionality of capitalism, sexism, and racism. And I want to just put a plug out there for the concept of intersectionality, because I know in many radical feminist circles, I see a lot of eye rolling. Actually, radical feminism was the first to really talk about intersectionality. They might not have used that term, but they understood absolutely critically that you cannot make generalized statements about all women, because life is mediated by not only the fact that you're part of a sex-based oppression class, but also depending on your race and depending on your economic class. So they were very clear in the early days. And if you read some of the original books of the 1960s from radical feminism, Sisterhood is Powerful, Woman Hating, This Bridge Called My Back, all of these great books, they really got that you have to understand women as a sex-based class mediated by other forms of oppression. So I really think it's important that we pull back intersectionality from the liberal feminists who have turned it into an identity politics thing, and we put back the material reality of women's lives. Now, I just want to remind you, in the good old days, what feminism was, right? And this is Barbara Smith. Now, I don't know if those in other countries will know the importance of This Bridge Called My Back. It was probably, I think, the first mass-selling radical feminist book written primarily by women of color. And that was in 1981. And that was a very critical book to kind of really hold the feet to the fire of radical feminism, to take a race analysis. And what was said here is feminism is the, and I can't really read it, is the political theory and practice to free all women. Now, remember, she didn't say here women who live in the suburbs who are upper middle class and white. They talked about all women, women of color, working class, well, should be white women, poor women, physically challenged women, lesbians, old women. And she said, as well as white, economically privileged heterosexual women. Anything less than this is not feminism. And the reason this was said is because we talked about liberation. And liberation means that we liberate women, all women, as a sex class, which again, I'm going to get into. So the core of radical feminism is women exist as a subordinate sex class. That's how radical feminism differs from all other forms of feminism. And what was said, and this is, of course, nobody ever said things better than Andrea Dworkin, is the fate of every individual woman, no matter what her politics, character, values, qualities, is tied to the fate of all women, whether she likes it or not. So what Andrea Dworkin is saying here is that even if you don't like her, she's your sister. So this is a call for sisterhood and a type of collective radical change that understands the meaning of liberation rather than what we've moved to today, which is empowerment. So radical feminism, unlike liberal feminism, had a structural view. And that structural view owed a lot to Marxism. So I actually got to radical feminism through Marxism. Although I live in the States, you can tell from my accent that I was born and raised in Manchester. And I did my PhD in England in sociology. And when I did my PhD, then you could not come out of sociology and not be a Marxist. Basically, you were fed Marxism day in, day out. And it was such an eye-opening experience. So that was my real first introduction. And then when I read Radical Feminism, it was like, you know, this all makes perfect sense. So I'm just going to give some of the quotes from Marx, which actually had been some of the foundational assumptions of radical feminism. So he said men, and I'm adding women in here, make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past. So what he's doing here is he's blowing apart the notion of free choice and agency, because although people, and women will talk about now, make their own history, you don't get the choice of how you're going to live your life, because you are born into a set of material circumstances that are not of your own making. And this was central to Marxism, of how the structural world within which you're born decides the choices that you have, or for most people don't have. Men and women, say women, enter into the relations that are specific, necessary, and independent of their will. The totality of these relations of production form the economic structure of society, the real basis from which rises a legal and political superstructure. The mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process generally. Now, what is critical here is that for Marx, there is two levels. There is the economic base, i.e. capitalism. It could be socialism, but we know it's mostly across the world is capitalism. And that economic base, the politics and the reality of that economic base, capitalism, then shapes everything else in the world, which includes the legal system, the education system, the cultural system, the ideology within which all we live. But for Marx, imagine it's a house, and the foundation of the house, society, is the economic base. And what those are the economic relations of production. That then goes on to inform the rest of the life. Now, for feminism, we have to include patriarchy here, because the base for women's lives is indeed capitalism, but also critically patriarchy. And that base conditions the rest of our lives. But the other important thing about this is that it is the materiality. We are absolutely hinged to, structured in a system not of our own making. And so every choice, every decision, so-called agency, has to be understood within that wider political system. For Marx, it was patriarchy. For radical feminists, it's patriarchy, it's capitalism, it's racism, it's colonialism. All of those structures determine women's lives. Now, let's have a look at how this concept was taken into radical feminism. So by patriarchy, and this is a quote from Ruth Blair from 1984, by patriarchy, I mean the historical system. So we can already see, drawing from Marx, of male domination, a system committed to the maintenance and reinforcement of male hegemony. Male hegemony means male power, the way that men think, their ideologies. Patriarchy's institutions direct and protect the distribution of power and privilege to those who are male, apportional, however, according to social and economic class. Now, this is where, again, intersectionality comes out, because what Ruth Blair is saying is, look, not all men have the same power. You take poor white men, take African-American men of any class in this country, and they have a very different power system to white men. So a good example of this, the perfect example, are people like Weinstein and Epstein. Just look at the way in which patriarchy protected them all. And also, interestingly, African-American men R. Kelly, Bill Cosby. So in a way, the economic system of capitalism, where you have very wealthy men, especially protects these wealthy men, because poor men would not have got away with this whole ecosystem of trafficking, pimping, raping that people like Hefner, Epstein, and Weinstein got away with, and Woody Allen and others as well. So now let's look at what happened with third wave feminism. So we had the second wave, which was a battle between radical feminism and liberal feminism. And I was lucky enough to come of age in second wave feminism. And if anyone remembers the wonderful days of what it was like to have radical feminist concerts, radical feminist communities, radical feminist joke nights, radical feminist game nights, radical feminist bookstores. I mean, we used to hang out at a radical feminist bookstore. There's no such thing anymore anywhere. I mean, it was an incredible experience. And I feel so lucky that I came of age during that period. So let's look at now how we've gone down the rabbit hole of craziness. So this is Jennifer Bogardner. She was one of the founders of third wave feminism. And she said in an article in Alternet, which by the way is a progressive website, she says feminism is something individual to each feminist. Would somebody explain to me how you build a movement based on an individual meaning of its members? Could you imagine saying something like the labor movement is something individual to each worker? You'd have no labor movement, you'd have no unions. Or the civil rights movement is something individual to every person of color. You can't build a movement on individual ways of thinking. A movement is built on the collective theory and practice. That's how you build a movement. So here we see individualism really enter into what is considered feminism. So in mainstream third wave feminism, there is an individualistic view that celebrates free choice, agency, and empowerment. Now, I want to be very clear. I have a lot of choice. I have a lot of agency, and I have so much empowerment, I don't know what to do with it. In fact, at the bottom of my street, the gym is called Empowerment. So if I want a dose of empowerment, I just have to go to the gym called Empowerment. So see how ridiculous all of this is? The fact that I have all of these is because I am a white, educated, middle-class woman. And that meant shit for the women who, when I finished teaching my courses, would come in at night to clean my classroom in university. What did my so-called empowerment and agency have anything to do with their lives? In fact, my empowerment and agency was built on the backs of those women's lives. And just to give you a story, I was feeling very sorry for myself. This was before COVID, because I was on a lecture tour and I was exhausted and I was going from one city to the next. And the United States is a huge country, so everything, of course, is flying. I was eating, airport, horrible food, I wasn't sleeping well. And I get back to Boston, my home, and it's like we're the last plane to land. And I'm really feeling sorry for myself. My back aches, I'm hungry, I'm tired. And then I see a group of women of color, like literally hundreds of them coming at me, all wearing a t-shirt, the same t-shirt. And I couldn't really see. And I thought, is there a convention going on? And they're all getting off the same plane, because there were just hundreds of women. And it looked like they were pushing luggage. And then as I get closer, it was hundreds of women of color coming to clean the airport. Now think of this. They live a life that's kind of in the dark. When everyone else has gone home from the office buildings, in come the really subordinate class of women of color, who probably, by the way, this is very likely their third job, because in the United States of America, poor families cannot exist without having at least 3 jobs between them. And I thought, oh my God, here was me thinking this was some event or tournament, so out of touch with the reality of what goes on at midnight in an airport. So what happened when we moved from radical to liberal and then neoliberal is sex as a material reality cemented in and reproduced by patriarchal institutions of equality, which is the radical feminist view, turn to gender as an identity that is fluid and unhinged from patriarchal institutions that reproduce inequality. So we moved from a structural understanding of power cemented into institutions to gender. You can identify in or out of it. You choose what you're going to be. As Eddie Izzard said, he was in girl mode that day, right? Next day, maybe he's in boy mode. I don't know what he is. I'd like to go up to those women who I saw at that airport and ask them, you know, what's your gender identity today? And would you like to identify out of it? Maybe you'd like to identify out of your class position as well. So you're not starting work at midnight cleaning the airports. The reality is you can't identify in and out of things because you are cemented into a structure. So the question is, how did we get here? How did we get to this third wave faux feminism? And I blame specifically these two. Why? Because they brought in neoliberal economics. Now, we've always had neoliberal economics in capitalism, but these two really dug in deep into it. Now, neoliberal economics is a way in which the argument, you know, that money trickles down, which of course it doesn't, it stops with the upper class, and that there is no such thing as society, right? The idea is everybody's just going around maximizing their own agency. Now, with neoliberal economics, which is basically legitimizes capitalism on steroids, comes an ideological arm. And the ideological arm of neoliberal economics is all about the fact that there is no structural inequality. That's in neoliberal economics, the ideology is no structural inequality, no systems of oppression, we just groups with collective interests, and that includes the oppressed, right? They're a group, there's no groups, they're just all individuals, the elite, with just, you know, simple interests, not collective. There's just lots of individuals making lots of individual choices with lots of self-empowerment. That is the ideological arm of neoliberalism, individuals making lots of individual choices with lots of self-empowerment. Now, this is a joke on the oppressed, because the only groups that are lots of individuals making lots of individual choices, according to neoliberalism, is actually the poor, because they fully know that there is in groups that have collective interests. This is the World Economic Forum. This is where the richest people in the world get together in Davos every year. Now, when they sit there talking, what do you think they're talking about? What they had for dinner last night? They're talking about how they're going to set the world economics as a way to maintain the elite class and their billions. So the rich know full well that this is bullshit. Lots of individuals making lots of it. They've developed a ideology to fool the rest of us. And you know what? Neoliberal and liberal feminists fell for it. They actually bought the ideology of neoliberalism that was propagated specifically by Reagan and Thatcher. And many of the third wave feminists were actually, they were born into this era. This is the only thing they've known is neoliberal economic ideology. So there's no surprise that Jennifer Bogarden says there's no such thing, you know, as feminism, it's all individual. So they're just mouthing the neoliberalism that they have internalized. So if we add together mainstream neoliberal discourse, postmodernism, where basically nothing's real, everything's constructed, gender, sex, etc. Gender is socially constructed, sex is absolutely not socially constructed. Queer theory, which actually was about the erasure of lesbians as a resistant political force. Right? Queer theory became all about having sex and who with and what about and lots of stuff. When in radical feminism, lesbianism was specifically a political resistant force that refused to collaborate with the patriarchy. And again, the move from women's studies to gender studies killed radical feminism. And I watched it die, right? Because when I went into the academy, I was the chair of women's studies, and it was a radical. We only have radical feminist teaching, mainly because I did a lot of the hiring, or we had good hiring practices. And then I saw, not at my college, but in other colleges, the women's studies went away. In came gender studies or queer studies. And you know what? A lot of the departments are headed by men. When I was often on my tours giving lectures, I can't tell you how many queer studies or gender studies departments were headed by men. And I remember one particular time I was invited to give a talk, some in the Midwest, and I was and before I gave the talk, I had dinner with the graduate students. And I would ask them, what's your dissertation on, etc. And they'd all say Foucauldian this and Foucauldian that. And I'm sitting there and they're all calling themselves feminists. And they're all basing their life on Foucault. We won't even go into the history of Foucault and what he got up to in his private life, right? But I said to them at one point, I said, there's women who write books. Foucault is not the only person. But it was just an astounding way that I saw radical feminism completely destroyed. And in came Foucault and, of course, Judith Butler, who I don't think deserves the term feminism. So now let's look at this and see how this maps onto porn and so-called sex work, because we're in this sort of mess of pro-porn, pro-sex work argument because of the neoliberal input. So let's begin with the heyday of radical feminism, organizing against pornography. We had great books. We had Andrea Dworkin, we had Take Back the Night, we had Not for Sale, we had Susan Griffith's Pornography and Silence. I mean, these were the books that without which, had I not read them, and I was like an undergraduate student when I read these. And I remember, to this day, if I had not read these books, I would still be looking at pornography thinking, there's something about this I don't like, but I can't figure out what it is. These are the books that mentored me and the radical feminist ideology. So I wanted to take, again, Andrea Dworkin. And she said, think about pornography as a new institution of social control, a democratic use of terrorism against all women, a way of saying to every woman, look down, bitch, because when you look up, you're going to see your legs spread. Now, I want to say something about Andrea Dworkin. I don't know how she sat for as long as she did looking at pornography without really much written and understanding. How did she get that understanding that pornography is the eroticization of inequality? I mean, all of those who work against pornography, we built on that view, but that view to have come to it literally on your own, sitting there looking at it, was a brilliance that I cannot begin to understand. So we've got that from Dworkin. And then we end up with this, a bestseller, The Feminist Porn Book. Now, I have to tell you, I did not think I would ever live long enough to see these words all put together. This is a book, okay, and now it's got a journal, which is basically about how great porn is for women. And I mean, every time I read it, my stomach hurts. So this is the review on Amazon. The Feminist Porn Book identifies the importance of pornography as a form of expression and labor in which women and other minorities produce power and pleasure. Does anybody know what the fuck this means? Because I don't know. Right? What the hell does it mean? A form of expression and labor in which women and other minorities produce power and pleasure. Yes, power and pleasure for men, but not for women. And they're saying that it's the women who do power and pleasure. So I want to give you an example of kind of that and how it sort of came against me when Pornland came out. So when Pornland came out and it was heavily reviewed, the worst review I got was in those places that call themselves feminist, okay? And the worst one was Ms. Magazine. It got reviewed very well in other places, but of course the neoliberal feminists came at this because this was one of the, I think the third book that had come out in the last 20 years, that's radical feminism, a view of pornography. And in Ms., they did a 4-part interview with me, and Shira Tarrant was the person who did it. So in my book, I talk about the violence of pornography. I talk about what it is. I talk about the women in porn, the performers, what happens to them, what happens to women in the real world. And then in order to argue against me, Shira Tarrant, who is a political scientist, goes and interviews one woman as a way to argue against my book, and says this woman is April Flores, who is a actual porn performer, and said and she says there is no doubt porn is a very physical job. However, it's also a very individualized profession. A performer always has the choice, these are my italics, of not doing something they are not comfortable with. Complete lie, right? What it says in when you read the porn business press, which I do, is I was reading an article that said, like, women sign contracts. The contracts are ridiculous. It says just tick what sex acts you'll do. They're not informed consent contracts. So a woman will say she'll do anal or she won't. She'll do double anal, oral, whatever. And then in this article I read in Adult Video News, which is, I said, the business press of the porn industry, it says the first day on the set, get her to do something she said she wouldn't do, because then you've broken her. And that was in this article, directed to producers and directors, break her on the first day. And I can't tell you how many porn performers exited I have interviewed who've said the same thing. Something happened to me on that first day on the set. Something crossed over in me and I was never the same again. You know what it was? They were raped. That's what happened to them. But because they think they signed a contract, they thought it was consent. And this is how this whole thing is thought of, as consent, because they signed some stupid contract that is meaningless. So this is what we think about in pornography. What was the view of my book was an individualistic view. They said that it's all about individual female performers. What's missing, of course, is that pornography is about an industry that is patriarchal and capitalist. It's not about the individual performers. They have absolutely no power. It's like saying Amazon is all about the individual workers. No, it's all about Jeff Bezos and all of his cronies who are making billions. So now let's get some reality about the porn industry and the sex industry. Porn is based on the degradation, humiliation, and destruction of women's bodies. The individual woman stands in for all women as a subordinate sex class. So in pornography, you might have an individual performer, but she stands in for all of us, for all women. And pornography is a conversation between men written on the female body. She is almost a blank slate for them onto which they write and speak about patriarchy, power, and misogyny. That's the role of pornography. So in the gold standard study by Anna Bridges, they found that 90% of the most watched scenes had at least one kind of violence against women. Now, Anna Bridges and a team have just updated it. I've seen a pre-publication version, and you know what that 90% is now? 100%. Which I'm not surprised. Having watched more pornography than any human being should ever have to watch, I don't think I've ever seen a scene on Pornhub that is not violent. Now, these are the major sex acts in porn. So no matter how many categories, and there are millions of videos and about 94 categories, which include ebony porn, big tit porn, amateur porn. Amateur porn, by the way, is made by the porn industry to look amateur. It's a subsection of the porn industry. It's not made by people outside the porn industry. No matter what category you click on, you're going to get the same sex acts. So the one you're going to see all the time is choking, where the woman is being choked with a penis so far down her throat, she can't breathe. And the tears start to stream down her face, and she often vomits. Right? And they leave the vomit scene in, but she's gasping for breath. The second, probably actually another one just as equal, is strangulation. Now that's to be separated from choking. Strangulation, her hands around the throat. This can cause a stroke immediately. It can cause a heart attack. And these are porn-fueled men strangling women. We know that women who are battered and strangled during battery are more likely to die at the hands of the batterer. We also know that you can be strangled during sex, okay, and that you can pass out. Many of my students had this happen to them, pass out, and then wake up, think you're okay, go to bed a week later and die in sleep. Why? Because it takes sometimes a week for the throat passages to actually swell up. And this is being used all across America, strangulation, in a defense when a man murders a woman as rough sex. Now, I want us to think about the term rough sex, right? I have been sexually active my entire adult life. I have never been involved in any sexual experience where I could accidentally die. What do you have to be doing where you could accidentally die? It means it's violence. It's not sex, it's violence. If it just goes a bit too far, you can die. I mean, that is an argument used in the courts when in fact it should not be called rough sex. It should be called what it is, violence. Very, very rough anal sex in pornography. I mean, anal sex is the place where men deliver to women just what a bitch, whore, cunt she is. This is the place at which they really show women what they're worth. ATM, which is ass to mouth, where the penis goes into the anus and then into the mouth without washing. Ejaculation on the face, which every porn scene ends, and it's usually multiple men ejaculating, hitting, spitting in the face, name calling. So if you go onto Pornhub right now, which I don't recommend you do, no matter what you click on, the chances are you will see a woman being choked with a penis, strangled, being anally, vaginally, orally penetrated by 3 men, being hit, being spat in the face, and being called a bitch, whore, and a cum dumpster. That is your standard one. And the ejaculation is dripping down her face. So let me give you an example. I didn't use any pornography images, but it's just enough to tell you what the text is. So this is from Gag Me and Then Fuck Me. Do you know we say to things like romance and foreplay? We say fuck off. We take gorgeous young bitches and do what every man would really like to do. We make them gag till their makeup starts running, and then we give them a sticky back. Now, look how clever this is. We take gorgeous young bitches and do what every man would really like to do. The truth is, not every man really wants to do this. I mean, a lot do, but not every man. But what you're saying is this is grooming boys into being porn users and misogynists, because we take gorgeous young bitches and do what every man would really like to do. Young boys, and the average age of viewing this type of pornography now is 8. They don't know that not every man wants to do this. They've got no repertoire of sex to call upon to argue against this, and they live in a misogynist culture, and so this is how they're being socialized by porn. This is promotional copy from anally ripped whores. We at Pure Filth know exactly what you want. Chicks being ass fucked till their sphincters are pink, puffy, and totally blown out. Adult diapers just might be in store for these whores when their work is done. This is, by the way, all free. Average 8-year-old gets to in 6 seconds. We at Pure Filth know exactly what you want. You see again what they're laying a trap. What they're saying is, you want to be a man? This is your rite of passage into masculinity. And we know who you are. This is who you are. So pornography is a major groomer of men, and of course is linked to violence against women. Now, this was put out by the Adult Industry Medical Healthcare System, which was a kind of a volunteer group. And this talks about what women get. So this is who did the testing for HIV and all the other STIs. And they had on their front page the things to look out for. So this is part of your job: HIV, chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis, hepatitis, herpes, genital warts, crabs, etc. Gonorrhea of the throat. We now also, by the way, just before the porn industry shut down, before COVID, they had gonorrhea of the eye going around, an antibiotic resistant strain of gonorrhea of the eye. Now I want to talk about sex work versus prostituted women. So in sex work, when they use that term, the focus is on the women, decontextualized from the economic, political, and legal context of the buying and selling of women. So sex work is a great term to use because it cleanses, it whitewashes all of what's going on. This is from the Open Society. Sex work is a consensual transaction between adults where the act of selling or buying sexual services is not a violation of human rights. The Open Society is run by George Soros, who is one of the biggest enemies we've got. So sex work is a consensual transaction. Notice there's no mention of men or women here. It's just adults doing consensual buying and selling. There's not women being pimped or anything like that. It's just consensual sex work. And it's not, by the way, a violation of human rights. Now, when you use the term prostituted women, what you then have to do is to bring in a structural analysis, because the buying of sex, which is actually women, requires an economic system that commodifies humans, i.e. capitalism. It requires patriarchy that makes women and children the obvious groups to commodify. And it requires racism that makes women of color the most likely group of women to commodify. Now, what else does prostitution need? Right? We never see men. Have you noticed? When they talk about prostitution, you think it's cars buying women. Right? You very rarely see the pictures of men, the Johns. They've become the disappeared of prostitution. So just in case, and by the way, they're the disappeared of third wave feminism. No one talks about men. So if you've forgotten what they look like, I'm just showing you here a picture. These are men, they're Johns, recently arrested. So this is where the focus should go on. Everyone wants to talk about, why do women choose this? Why do women choose that? I want to know why men choose pornography, why they choose to buy women, because they are the one with the choices. The pimps and the Johns are all nurtured, socialized, and protected by a patriarchal infrastructure made up of multiple institutions. So what do we want as radical feminists? So there's this beautiful pie, right? Do we want the whole pie? And look, it's very, very nice. It's delicious. There's no question. Liberal feminists want half the pie. Now, I have to admit, that is more appetizing, the whole pie. Look how well appetizing. Who wants to eat that? Half the pie. So that's the liberal feminists. The neoliberals want the crumbs. They're happy with crumbs from the table of patriarchy. What do we want? We want no pie. We want to get rid of the pie. The pie is poisonous. And who wants to take anything from that pie? Anyone who takes a mouthful is poisoned by it. Our job as radical feminists is to rebuild a pie, to reconstitute it with love, with equality, with compassion and intimacy, and where human beings, all human beings, are treated with the dignity and respect that we are entitled to. That's the pie we want. We are not here as feminists to do to men what they have done to us, although I understand the desire, believe me, given the rage with which we all feel. But we are better than that. And we know that because we wouldn't be radical feminists if we weren't. So I want to say it is just wonderful speaking to radical feminists. I love it. It is my first language. I made sure my son's first language was radical feminism because that's the only way to save a man from being a misogynist. So I am so happy to be here and happy to take questions. Is there any way for capitalism to exist without patriarchal influence? You know, I can't imagine capitalism without patriarchy. I can't imagine capitalism without racism either, because there's certain people that are more and more, whose labor is more commodified and monetized. And because of the way that the systems intersect with each other, no, I can't imagine that at all. Gail, do you see economic class as encompassing sex class analysis? Is economic class the more basic oppression in your view? No, no. I wouldn't argue that economic class is the more basic oppression. What I would argue is we're in a system where the three almost seamlessly intersect. For women, of course, we have to take on patriarchy because this is where the wound is greatest for us because of the violence against women. That's critical. And until we women can live free from the fear of violence, we will never, never be liberated. That is the first and most important way in which women have to be liberated. There's no question that violence in pornography is an incredible backlash against, and it's mainly again upper middle class white women who have actually had the goodies or the crumbs of the patriarchal table. But you know what pornography does is it says to women, listen, you bitch, You thought you were powerful. You thought you could have our jobs, right? That job has got my name on it. You bitch can't have it. And you know what? This is where you should be. Your legs spread, being penetrated. But pornography, although it's men having a conversation, it's a way to deliver to us just what men really think. And I have to say, no piece of propaganda ever delivers a message as succinctly as pornography. It is an incredible system. It delivers the propaganda of misogyny to men, to the penis to the brain via the penis, which is an incredibly powerful system, and it delivers it to us via a whole body thud. When we look at pornography as women, it takes our breath away, because that's what changed my life. That first time when I was 21 and was living and saw, I think I was living in England or Israel at the time, and I saw the first feminist anti-porn slideshow. My life changed forever that night. I was doing my PhD on the sociology of education and sexism. I went home and called my advisor and changed it. And I did my PhD on the sociology of pornography, because that night people say to me, how did you get into this? And I say, I didn't get into this. This got me. This got me. When I saw those images, which, believe me, were nothing like what's mainstream today. I mean, God, it's almost like longing for Playboy, Penthouse and Hustler, given what's mainstream today. I thought, women can't live. They cannot live with this. It was so visceral. And I'm sure for so many women, when you look at pornography, it is so visceral. What better way to tell you just who you are? What can we see in 10, 20, 30 years further down the line? You know, it shudders. I shudder to think, if we don't really organize like we need to. First of all, we've got, you know, obviously the global crisis, the climate crisis we've got to deal with. We'll all be living God knows where, right? The refugees will all be global refugees. And if this continues, let me say, we now have a generation of boys who've been brought up on hardcore pornography. Their sexual templates, their ideology, their notion of masculinity, all formed by pornography. They are now going to go into early adulthood. What kind of men are they going to be when their sexual template was formed by violence, images of violence against women that they masturbated to? And remember, ejaculation, again, is a full body experience. It changes the neurons, it changes the limbic system. It is right cemented in their body, those women hating images. So what doctors, lawyers, teachers, who are they going to be? Our life and our daughters' lives and our granddaughters' lives are going to be unbearable. This is why I feel such a, you know, we've got to do something now. We've already lost a generation of boys, and I shudder to think who they're going to be. Well, we're beginning to see it. We're beginning to see the kind of, really, I mean, masculinity is always toxic by very nature in patriarchy, but we're really seeing what they're like and the violence. And I fear for our future, which is why I go out there in a state of desperation, saying we cannot afford to have, and you know, radical feminists are sometimes good at infighting. We cannot afford that, right? We've got, this is a life and death issue, not just on pornography, but on so many, but on pornography, these men will be basically slaughtering women in the streets. This is what they're learning. Is there any research about successful strategies in putting teenage boys off porn? Yes, there is research to show, actually, interestingly enough, the research shows that the more parents are skilled and confident in talking to their kids about pornography, or any adult, the less likely they are to go to pornography. So this is a plug for Culture Reframed, which is the organization that I'm part of, where we build programs for parents. They're free, and they build the confidence, the skills in parents to have these conversations. They were built by pediatricians, they were built by multidisciplinary pediatricians, sexual health experts, obviously it's all with a feminist lens, and It teaches you as the caregiver, the adult, how to talk to kids. It's very user-friendly. It's got lots of videos embedded. We've even at the end got we've scripted out conversations you can have about porn, about sexting, about rape, all of these things. So I definitely recommend that you do that. And speak, you know what, speak to your kid about porn. Because if you don't have that conversation, the porn industry will. And what we say is don't have 100-minute conversation. Have 100 one-minute conversations. I used to do this with my son all the time. We'd be going past a billboard and I would see something and I would just, and this was when he was very little, and I'd just say, oh, what's wrong with that? And he'd go, oh, it's so sexist, look how she's dressed. And then, oh, gone, no lecturing. And at 4 years old, I go in and he's watching National Geographic and he's pointing at the TV and he's shaking his head. I said, what's the matter? He said, well, they keep talking about man and his environment. What about women and their environment? He was outraged that they weren't talking about women. This is the capacity that boys and girls have. Right? The words that were coming out of his mouth at the age of 3, sexism, patriarchy, misogyny, we teach them radical feminism as their first language. Well, that is a great buffer against it. It's not the only one, but it is absolutely critical to that. What is the best thing we can do to continue to bring down the porn industry? I would say the most powerful way is, first of all, we do mass awareness. We start a movement where it becomes absolutely impossible for the porn industry to do business, which actually did happen in the 70s and 80s. We made life, well, I was too young at that time, but we made life impossible, or the radical feminists did, for the porn industry. And Dworkin and McKinnon wrote the ordinance law to try and sue them in civil cases. Now, the good news is the biggest single porn company in the world, MindGeek, which is located in Canada, which has about, controls about 10 to 15 of the most traveled websites, including Pornhub. They now have, I think, 6 class action suits against them, civil cases in the United States. Now, the importance of this in the United States is when you go into a civil class action suit, it's not like England where you're dealing with maybe thousands. Here it's millions and millions and millions of dollars. I was an expert witness in a class action suit against Girls Gone Wild. I don't know if anyone remembers that company, Girls Gone Wild, which was one of the first porn companies on the web when they went onto the internet. We bankrupted him. We did 3 class action suits, and by the 3rd he was bankrupt. The best way, you know, the pornographers they get erections around money, not sex. Right? When I go to those porn conventions, and I managed to sort of get in as friends of mine get me a journalist pass, and I go into their webinars and their discussion groups and everything else, they don't talk about sex, they talk about money. So I do not think going the criminal route is much use, because if you just put one pornographer in prison, there'll be a million others. I say bankrupt them. Make it so that if you go into porn and you become a porn producer, the chances of you making money are very low, because we're coming at you with as many class action suits as we can. Why is radical feminism not allowed today? Well, there's many reasons for that. I think one of the major reasons is, well, there's a few. We lost the academy, which was critical. The academy was critical because it brought out new generations of radical feminists. Those of us, I mean, that's how we got into it, is we would, you know, and I know I brought a whole generation out after 30 years of teaching. And now when I see what they're being taught, and when I go and lecture in universities, the pushback I get from these, the worst is if anyone's doing women's studies, gender studies, or queer studies, if that's their major, they're the worst, the absolute worst. They are, I mean, and the best are people doing things like sociology and psychology, which require an empirical base. But the most stupid, misogynist questions come from anyone doing gender studies and women's studies. That's gone. It's all a waste of time. Also, we don't have radical feminist communities like we had. I mean, virtually, I would say, well, for example, in this country, when I first came, for those of you who remember Mary Daly, she ran a series of lectures at Harvard called the Witch Lectures, which stood for Wild Independent Thinking Crones and Hags. And every week, you knew at Harvard there was going to be a radical feminist talk. Then we'd all go out for dinner or something afterwards, or drinks. Then you could go off to the radical bookstore to hang out, and then there was always music on another night. This community building was so critical, because this is not easy work, right? This is such difficult work, because one thing about radical feminism is it is joyful, because it opens your eyes, and you cannot live a full life, half asleep. I felt like I was in a coma. I was in a patriarchal induced coma till I discovered radical feminism. And then I woke up. But as you wake up, you discover the horrors. I mean, it is the horrors of what men have done. And in order to sustain yourself, you need that support network, because you can be both liberated, which you are, and joyful, but with being alone with that knowledge of how terrible the world is, and what unspeakable things men do to women, just tears away at your soul if you're alone. And so what I think is, once we can all get back to meeting, is we need to start community building, where we support each other. And I'll tell you who's got the best group of this is Norway. I've been to Norway many times to speak for the radical feminist group, UTA. I've probably pronounced it horribly, but it's something like UTA. They have this incredible community of thousands of women who are sort of put into little cells, who go out for dinner regularly, who connect with each other regularly. Every time they do demonstrations, which they do great demonstrations, I've been on some of them, which are wonderful, they then all go out together in groups. They then have a phone tree and a Zoom tree. I mean, it's just incredible the way they support each other. You cannot do this work, which is why I think this is just so difficult for all of us, is because we are alone in many cases. I say, be as fierce and as radical as you can stand. And you know what? Don't feel, a lot of people say, I feel bad that I can't look at pornography, or I can't do this. Don't feel bad. Take your chunk of the apple, or patriarchy, that you can deal with, and go for it. Because you don't have to do everything. Pick your chunk that you're comfortable with and go for it, and drill down into it. Don't feel like you have to do everything. But the more we each pick it this way, and we hack away at pornography, patriarchy, the more likely we are to tear down this most vicious, hateful system that will eventually destroy not just us, but the world, if we don't stop it. But on a good note, let's thank the goddess for all those radical feminists that came before us, that laid the groundwork and made it possible for all of us to be here. Because without them, we'd all be those mad women in the Victorian literature screaming in the attic in the night, because we'd have nothing else. We'd have no words. All we would be able to do was scream our rage. At least they gave us the language, they gave us the courage, and they gave us the joy of radical feminism. So thank you.